Yeah, hello everyone. This might become a bit controversial, as you might see from the title already. It's called Embracing the Render Method, an Unconventional Approach to Data Fetching. But first, some notes about myself. I'm Daniel. You also can call me David. It'll be fine for the first 5 minutes, then I'm probably going to tell you. I've been a full-time web developer since about 2012, and I've been working with React since version 0.12, which is about, I don't know, 5 years old. So it's been quite some time. I've seen a lot of trends come and go, and my current project I'm working on is called Codex.io. It's a playful approach to project management. So if you're interested in a cool project management tool made in Berlin, go check it out. And this was also of relevance of how it come about that I'm here talking to you, because at the last event of React Open Source, I was talking with Carl Hawkey, who was organizing it back then. And since there was one talk about GraphQL, he was asking me whether I was also working with GraphQL. And I was telling him that I really would have liked to, but back then when I started working with Codex 3 years ago, the specification hasn't been out yet, but I really, really liked the idea. So I just came up with my own graph-based API, which I'm very, very happy with. And since GraphQL hasn't been out, there was neither Apollo nor, what's the other one? Relay, exactly, neither the first nor the second version. So I told him what I was doing instead. And once I was finished, he was just, okay, you definitely should give a talk about this, so other people can know and learn from what has been going on. So before I start talking about data fetching, let's make a short detour towards another initially controversial topic, which is how to combine components and CSS. So you might remember, or well, at the very beginning, all you did was you required some CSS. Either, if you were advanced back then, you had like one CSS file per component, but it might have been as fine to just include a global index CSS for your whole project. And of course, this was full of issues because you had to come up with lots of conventions and discipline to adhere to those conventions. For example, how do you deal with namespacing for your components? So there were several methodologies back then, or they still are, with very, very fancy abbreviation, OOCSS, SMAX, and BAM, and many, many more. And there were also lots of discussions on how would you call a button, like which class would you assign to a button? Would you use rather a syntactic version, like a huge red button, or would you use a semantic naming, like call to action button, or would you go with an atomic class approach, like it's white, it has a red background, and a padding of class 2. So there were lots of questions, and they all were based around the fact that naming is indeed a very hard thing in engineering. So we needed a solution. And I'm not sure whether you've seen it. If you haven't, you definitely, it's definitely still worth watching. Vuik's talk back in 2014, where he was presenting his approach to CSS in JavaScript, where he was outlining the issues that came with using CSS and how those issues needed to be tackled when working with styles in a bigger scale. So let's have a look at the spectrum of styling solutions that came up once CSS and in JavaScript became more and more popularized. So at the very top of the spectrum, you have like global styles that I've been just talking about with all those namespacing issues. So we're using CSS, less, or sus. And at the very bottom end of the spectrum, there were inline styles where basically either you used the HTML tag inline styles, or you were using some library that pretty much worked like in like inline styles. JSX styles was one of the more prominent early solutions where all you did was writing down your components and applying those inline styles directly inside of your component, where basically you had no namespacing issues because all the information was right there where you wanted to have it, right in the component itself. But there were other solutions coming up as well. So one approach, or two approaches that I listed here are collocated styles in an extra file. So both CSS modules and CSS blocks, which is a very new library which was released last month, I believe, by LinkedIn, use this approach, which allow you to write CSS, but it gets compiled with CSS blocks. It gets heavily compiled into a namespaced version and potentially some further processing. So you don't have to think about namespacing all that much. Another approach is that you use collocated styles in the same file. That is, within your component file, you have like one section where you define the styles in an object shape or as a string, and then create a component with that style, and then use this component later on in your render component. So Aphrodite or styled components would be two examples of that. And then there are also some in-between solutions like Glamorous and Emotion, which allow you to do both, like either define your styles in an extra part of your file, or even within your render method, you can modify the component within your render method itself. And both directions of the spectrum come with its own advantages. Like the further up you go, the easier it is for the compiler to make some optimizations, because it's much easier to extract like information from a single file versus inspecting what you're rendering and how exactly you're composing your component tree. And the further down you go, the less moving parts you have. That is, it's much easier to go through your files and move bits around, because there's no collocation happening. So you don't have to track several places at once. If you are moving a file or if you're deleting something, you don't have to really check if you have forgotten something while moving or deleting. So the further down you go, the easier time you have potentially maintaining your code in the long run. So after this detour, you might understand a bit better where I'm coming from when we're now talking about data fetching. So the classic model back then and even now is just using a REST API, which kind of works like a global CSS sheet in our analogy. So you have quite a big disconnect between the front end and the back end team. It's not just across files, but oftentimes between teams that define what data you need and what data you actually are getting. And again, you have like lots of issues coming up around naming. So are you using post, or are you using put, or even are you using patch to be properly using idiomatic REST, or what kind of paths are you using? Are you either using deeply nested ones, or are you using parameters? Look, lots of questions that aren't really helping the product itself. It's just necessary to basically have enough discipline to adhere to one style and to work around all those issues. GraphQL was coming from Facebook, and the idea here is to give the responsibility to the front end, so that your components can define what data am I actually needing, what shape of data, and you then ask for. You can then define a query in your front end, for example, like this, where we're asking for a user of a specific ID, and all we need from that user is the first name and the last name. And then after you sending that query to the server, you get data with the exact same shape, and you can use it in your React component like this. Here I'm using the Apollo client version, where you pass in the query, you pass in the variables that you want to be using, and then get the data back after it has been fetched from the server. So this is definitely a big improvements in terms of developer experience. And to put it into perspective, let's reuse the same spectrum from before, where at the very top end, we again have like this global system where you have a big separation between the back end and the front end that is used by the REST API. And in the middle, you have the collocated data definition, where in the same file you define at one point what kind of data your component is using, and then within the render method, you can use that query to get the data of the exact shape. But I'm arguing you can get even further by going directly into the render method and have no duplication of your data definition, because all the information you need you get out of your render method yourself. As far as I'm aware, there is no existing solution out there, which is why I'm giving this talk, to maybe inspire you or to maybe tell me why this is a silly idea. But let's go through this talk first to give you some ideas how this could look like and how this could work. Again, you can. There are two. Possibly more aspects to the spectrum. The further up you go, the easier it is to do some optimizations, because caching is much easier if you have predefined endpoints, because the more dynamic it gets, the harder it gets to really know what kind of endpoints or what kind of data your app really needs, unless you do some heavy compilation of your code base. And the further down you go, the easier again it is to do to move stuff around. So let's see an example of what I mean when I'm talking about inline fetching. So the idea is, if you have a profile component where you'd like to display the first name and the last name of a user, is to create like a magic instance of the type user, where you pass it the ID, and all you do is using this magic instance and call user.firstName and user.lastName, and somehow your app knows what to do, like what information you really want from the server, calls it and renders it on the page as the render method defines it. So to give you an even more detailed example, let's imagine, again, we create our magic user instance, and we can pass this user instance around. For example, we can pass into an avatar component. We can query all the posts of that user and display a post component for all the posts. And the avatar component just uses this user as it would use any data that has been loaded from the server, where you can call the profile image and you get the URL from the profile image, call the first name and even the post. You could call all kinds of information, the title and how many comments you've got, for example. So wouldn't it be nice to create a component like this, or a system like this, because this would allow you to not have the separation of defining the data shape at one place and then using this data at the other place, which could result in a disconnect at some point. It's quite easy to compose, as you've seen. Like, can become a bit a bit difficult to compose stuff in GraphQL, because you always have to remember what kind of data am I potentially getting within when composing stuff. And having it done automatically is definitely quite helpful. And of course, it's also quite easy, much easier to move code around and delete it, because again, it's not co-located. You don't have like several places where this is defined. It's just at this one place. So how would you go about to do that? One way to do that would, of course, be a compilation step. That is possible, I would say, but quite hard, because you need a really reliable typing system, which I feel isn't quite ready, or would be really, really hard to implement. Might be worth investigating, but there's a much easier solution for that. So the idea here is to use a model schema as well as Object.define property. And to give you an idea of what both of those terms mean, I'll give you a quick overview. So a model schema, if you're using GraphQL, you probably know already what that is. So in order for GraphQL to work, you need to define the types or the models you're using. So in our example, we know that we tell GraphQL that that our user has a first name, a last name, has a profile image, which again refers to another type that we have defined, as well as posts, which is a list of posts. And for the file and the post, we as well might refer to the fields and relations it is using. So this is already a lot of information, and a lot of information that we can use for our rendering system. Some of you might be wondering what's up with Object.define property. It's actually quite an old technology. It's on It's been defined in ES5, so it's even supported by Internet Explorer 9. So it's quite spread out by now, and it basically works like this. You can create an object and call Object.define property on that object and define a property on that object. So in our case, what we do is we define the property first name on our user. We tell it's not writable, it's read-only, and we can define a getter, which means you have a function where you can do whatever you want in order to return a value. So in our case, if we now call user.firstname, the return value is Hans, because that's what we told our getter to do. So to look at a more realistic example, we are assuming that we are working with a cache, where we have some data potentially loaded already on our client. So in that instance, in our getter method, we're looking inside the cache. Do we have a user object loaded already with the following ID, and do we have the property of first name loaded already? If that is the case, just get the information from the cache. If that isn't the case, queue a request for that exact information and return some string that we defined. It might be loading, it might be unknown, it might be null, whatever fits our use case here. And in case we call user.firstname, what is happening is we are returning loading if it's not in the cache, but also queue a request so that we can batch all those requests that are happening and create a query. And how exactly that works in the whole system, I'll show later on. Because first I'm quickly going to show you how it works for relation, this whole system. So for example, let's say we want to load the profile image for a user. What we can do is we ask our cache, hey, for our do we have information already for a user of or for a model of type user with a certain ID? Do we know the profile image already? If so, get a magic instance of type file with the corresponding ID. Of course, it gets a bit more complicated if it isn't in the cache already. In that case, again, if it's there, it's fine. We just return this magic instance of type file. If it isn't there, we queue a request and asking our server, OK, please load a user with the following ID and load its profile image. In the meantime, we create a nested ID. You can see it here, which has like a GraphQL-like shape, where we say, OK, this file has the ID, or you can get information for the file ID by going to the user, checking the profile image, and getting the ID out of there. And in the meantime, our magic instance works with that type of ID, which is really helpful for nesting, as you'll be able to see later on. So let's combine both our model schema as well as Object.define property. So here you can see how we turned, or how I turned the GraphQL definition into a JavaScript object where we define both the fields as well as the relations. And we can use this information to create, or to get our getInstance method, which is able to return those magic instances by creating properties for both fields as well as relations. So to give you an idea of how it actually works in a real random method, let's look at one example. So in this case, all we want to do is render a user and render its first name and as well as the profile image URL. And once we render this, and the cache has been empty, all we are returning is loading dash loading, but in the background, we've been queuing 3 requests. One for the first name of the user, then one for the profile image of the user, as well as the URL of the user's profile image. And we then need a process that basically batches all those requests and turns it into a GraphQL query, like this, for example. And so with this GraphQL query, you can go to the server, fetch the data required by a render method, and re-render it again. And in this case, this magic user instance has the information already in the cache and can return all the information that is provided in the cache. So in that case, we load the real name as well as the profile image URL. So to give you this, I mean, there probably are some questions like, oh, so it's basically just full of bogus data at the beginning. How will it look like in the on the first render? But there are some convenience methods, as I will show you. But there's also some more nice approaches for this technique. For example, you can think of having a hover method like this, which only loads data if the user is hovering the mouse over a certain field, and it would just work the same. Like the first time the user hovers it, this method is trying to be rendered. The cache isn't provided with any data yet, so it will render some loading state in the beginning. But once the reply from the server is back, we can fill it with data without needing any explicit place to say, okay, please load this data right now. It will all happen automatically by using the Object.define properties. Another thing that might be quite useful is to have your magic instance having some meta properties. Like, for example, you can check, does this magic component have a title and content in the cache already? If not, please load a spinner and just load all the title and the content in the background while showing the spinner. Another thing is sometimes you're not quite sure in your initial render method, is a certain branch being executed or not? For example, I only want to show the profile image if the user role is admin. So in the first pass, all you do is you load the first name and you load the role. And since the role isn't admin in the first pass, you won't execute the second code path. So you're loading the data from the first pass, and then no, okay, right, if the role is admin, I re-render it. And then the second code branch is being executed, and only then you load the data that is necessary for the more advanced use case. And again, you can work with default values. If you feel like, okay, this is a very common path to go, you might just assume the default value is admin, and it will always load that case. But in rare cases, it actually might help you save lots of data because you only really load what is needed defined by a render method. And one more thing that I'm quite intensively using within my code base is using helpers. Like, for example, you can count the amount of relation. For example, you can count the amount of posts a user has made. You might, for example, load the last post or the last end posts, or there are like several helpers that ensure that working with it, that basically all your work can be done within the render method. And if you're looking in the future, how it could look like with suspense, which is like a new modern React feature that might come out later this year, not too sure, where the idea is to interrupt a current render cycle if certain conditions are met or are not met. And in our case, we could imagine, okay, let's render our content and check whether our request queue has been filled by something because something hasn't been in the cache. If nothing has been required by our request, if our request queue is empty, we can basically, we know, okay, all the data that we require is there, we can render the content. If it's not there, we can just fetch the data, create a promise, and throw that promise, which is, as far as I'm aware, the signal for the suspense feature to tell, okay, please interrupt the current render method and wait until the promise has been resolved. And this works quite nicely, of course, if you're working with a render method, because all you need to know happens within the render method, and this could potentially work quite nicely. I mean, I haven't tested it yet, but this is at least some code I sketched out that might work, hopefully. But of course, there are also some downsides to this approach. So, for example, if somewhere in your code you see user.profile.url, you're not really sure, like, is this the real thing, or is it just like some magic things which hasn't been loaded yet? So sometimes when you really need to be sure that it's loaded, like for example URL, you don't want to have an image tag with a fake URL. You need to use those helpers, like is it in the cache, quite a lot. Another thing is that the first render, of course, won't have any data yet, so it will be full of loading or empty values that might look weird to the user. But of course, using those helper methods, you can embrace this loading state, and since the render method needs to render something in order to know what kind of data I need, this actually might help perceived performance, because you're rendering something that looks like some real data. It's just powered by those fake instances. And of course, it's quite hard to apply caching on the backend side because those queries are generated on the fly and might vary from user to user. And then, of course, like another big downside is that there's no available open source solution yet. And I don't see myself being able to responsibly open source the code I've provided yet, because this feels like a full-time project to compete with Apollo and the others, because it's quite a big scope if you want to deal with real-time updates and mutations and all of that. And there's just too little time in this life, at least. But since this is a React open source meetup, I wanted to show you what I've been working on, and maybe some of you feel inspired to play around with code like this. And I'm definitely happy to talk with you because I've got 2 working projects out there that are which I'm quite happy with. Like, it's actually one of the few cases where I'm using like quite a fundamental structure since like 3 years, and I'm still very, very happy working with it, which is quite rare so far. So if you want to have a look at 2 implementations, you can either look at the project management tool I'm working on or a pixel art community, which is a bit easier to access because you don't need to sign up. You can just browse around and see what it looks like. So yeah, that's me so far. So if you're interested in talking with me and following up, I guess Twitter might work best, or now that I'm here, you can also just grab me around. So thanks for your attention, and let's stay in touch.